The frozen shores of Nordfjord stretched endlessly before Astrid as she collapsed in the snow, her breath forming desperate clouds in the bitter air. 3 days had passed since the clan elders pronounced their cruel judgment. Barren women brought misfortune, they declared, casting her beyond the village walls to die alone. But Astrid harbored a secret that could have saved her. She wasn't just any village woman. She had once been a renowned healer, trained in the ancient ways of the Volva, the wise women who could read the threads of fate itself. Her barrenness had forced her to hide this gift, knowing the clan would see it as witchcraft rather than blessing. Now, as darkness crept across the landscape, a small figure emerged from the tree line. The chieftain's 6-year-old son, Bjorn, approached with fearless eyes and spoke a single word that would change everything, Mother. The boy had been mute since birth, yet somehow knew she was meant to guide him toward a destiny that would reshape their entire world. But what ancient prophecy connected this cast-out woman to the future king of the north? Astrid's eyes widened in disbelief. The word hung in the frozen air between them, crystallizing like her breath. She had watched Bjorn from afar during festivals and clan gatherings, always silent, always observing with those unnaturally bright blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond his years. The healers had declared him touched by the gods, blessed or cursed, none could say. "Child," she whispered, her voice hoarse from 3 days without proper water. "You should not be here. The woods are dangerous after nightfall." But Bjorn stepped closer, unafraid. In his small hands, he carried a leather pouch that Astrid recognized immediately, her own healing supplies, the ones the elders had confiscated when they'd stripped her of everything before the exile. How had this boy managed to retrieve them? "Mother," he repeated, and this time his voice carried an otherworldly resonance that made the very air around them shimmer. The aurora borealis began to dance overhead, though Astrid had never seen the northern lights appear so suddenly, so vividly. She struggled to sit up, her body weakened by exposure and starvation. "Bjorn, I am not your mother. Your mother was Sigrid the Fair. May the gods keep her soul." The boy's expression grew solemn. He knelt beside her in the snow, seemingly immune to the bitter cold that was slowly stealing the life from her limbs. When he placed his small hand on her forehead, warmth flooded through her, not the heat of fever, but something deeper, more primal. Suddenly, images flashed through Astrid's mind with startling clarity. She saw herself as a young girl, learning the sacred runes from her grandmother. She witnessed the moment she'd first heard the prophecy that would haunt her entire life. The woman who bears no child of her flesh shall mother the one who will unite the scattered clans under one banner. Through her wisdom, the mute prince shall find his voice and his calling. The vision shifted, showing her Bjorn's birth during the worst blizzard in living memory. She saw how his mother, the beloved Sigrid, had died, bringing him into the world. How the shamans had whispered that the boy's silence was connected to some greater purpose, that he waited for the right guide to unlock his destiny. Astrid gasped, pulling back from the boy's touch. "The prophecy," she breathed. "But I believed it was merely the ravings of old women." Bjorn smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed his young face. "The gods do not make mistakes, Volva. They made you barren so your heart would be free to love the child who needs you most." The fact that he knew the old word for wise woman confirmed what her heart had already begun to understand. This was no coincidence, no chance encounter in the wilderness. The threads of fate had been weaving this moment long before either of them drew breath. "Your father," Astrid said, thinking of Chieftain Eric Ironwolf. "He believes you will never speak, never lead. He has already begun training your cousin Magnus as heir." "Magnus is strong with sword and shield," Bjorn replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But the future needs more than warriors. It needs one who can heal the rifts between clans, who can read the signs in earth and sky." As if summoned by his words, wolves began howling in the distance, not the threatening calls of hungry predators, but something almost musical, welcoming. Astrid felt strength returning to her limbs, though she couldn't explain how or why. "Will you teach me, Mother?" Bjorn asked, using that word again with such natural ease that her heart ached with unexpected love. Will you help me become what our people need? Astrid looked into those ancient eyes set in a child's face and saw not just Bjorn's future, but her own purpose finally revealed. Perhaps the gods had not cursed her with barrenness after all. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and Astrid pulled her cloak tighter as she made her way down the rocky path toward the water's edge. 3 days had passed since Bjorn's pronouncement, 3 days of whispered conversations that died when she entered a room, of eyes that couldn't quite meet hers, of hands that no longer reached out in greeting. She had always risen before dawn to gather seaweed and check the fish traps, but now the familiar routine felt like exile disguised as purpose. The other women would be stirring soon, beginning their preparations for the day's work, their children waking warm and safe in their beds, children she would never have. The thought struck her like a physical blow, just as it had every morning since the pronouncement. She pressed her palm against her flat belly, willing herself to feel something, a flutter, a quickening, any sign that the seer had been wrong. But there was only the hollow ache that had become her constant companion. A sound made her freeze, crying, not the hearty wails of a healthy child, but something weaker, more desperate. Astrid's head snapped up, scanning the shoreline. There, wedged between 2 large stones, where the tide had deposited it, was a small boat. Her heart hammered as she scrambled over the slippery rocks. The vessel was foreign, its wood pale and unfamiliar, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Inside, wrapped in what had once been rich furs now sodden with seawater, was a child. Astrid's breath caught. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old, its skin pale as birch bark, lips tinged blue with cold. But its eyes, God's, its eyes were open and aware, watching her with an intensity that seemed impossible for one so young. They were the color of storm clouds, grey-green and shifting like the sea itself. Without hesitation, she lifted the child from the boat, her cloak already falling away to wrap around the small form. The baby's skin felt like ice, and she pressed it against her chest, her own body heat the only warmth she could offer. The crying subsided to weak whimpers. "Shh," she whispered, though her voice shook. "You're safe now." As she held the child close, something shifted inside her chest, not the emptiness she'd grown accustomed to, but a fierce protective warmth that spread through her like mead on a cold night. This was what she'd been missing, what her body had been preparing for all these years, not to bear a child, but to save one. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Magnus appeared through the mist, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable as he took in the scene before him. "Astrid!" His voice was carefully neutral. "What have you found?" She straightened, unconsciously shifting the child deeper into her cloak's protection. "A baby. The boat must have drifted here in the night." Magnus stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in her arms. When he spoke again, his voice held an odd note she couldn't identify. "May I see?" Reluctantly, she pulled back a fold of the cloak. The child's strange eyes immediately found Magnus's face, and Astrid saw the chieftain's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "The markings on the boat," he said, not looking away from the infant. "Did you examine them?" "I was more concerned with saving a life than studying carvings," she replied, allowing a hint of reproach to color her tone. For a long moment, Magnus said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "The child will need care, constant attention, warmth, food, protection." Yes, the word came out fierce, protective. "It will. The village has women who are nursing, who could." "No." Astrid's arms tightened around the baby. "I found this child. The gods delivered it to me here at this shore. That means something." Magnus's grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she'd never noticed before, a kind of weary knowledge, as if he carried secrets that aged him beyond his years. The gods' gifts often come with prices we don't expect to pay. "I've already paid my price," she said quietly. Cast out, made barren, marked as incomplete. If this is what the gods offer in return. She looked down at the child, whose breathing had grown stronger, whose skin was beginning to warm against hers. Then I accept, even if it makes you more of an outcast than before. A barren woman caring for a foreign child with no known parentage. Astrid met his gaze steadily. What more can they take from me? I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Something flickered across Magnus's face, approval perhaps, or relief. Then you'll need supplies, food, clothing, a place to raise the child properly. The offer surprised her, but she nodded gratefully. As Magnus turned to go, she called after him. What should I call the child? He paused without turning around. That choice is yours now. His words carried the weight of finality. Everything about this child's future is yours to decide. The coastal winds carried salt and the promise of winter as Astrid made her way down the treacherous path toward the harbour. 3 days had passed since her banishment, 3 days of sleeping rough in the abandoned fisherman's hut beyond the village boundaries. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and the bitter cold had seeped into her bones, but something else drove her forward now. Curiosity about the strange child she'd glimpsed in Jarl Eriksson's hall. The harbour bustled with morning activity. Fishermen mended nets while their wives sorted the dawn's catch, steam rising from their breath in the crisp air. Astrid pulled her worn cloak tighter and kept to the shadows between the storage sheds, avoiding the main thoroughfares where clan members might spot her. She had no right to be here anymore, but she couldn't shake the memory of those unusual eyes watching her from behind the chieftain's chair. A commotion near the largest longship drew her attention. Jarl Eriksson stood at the bow, his golden beard catching the pale sunlight as he directed the loading of supplies. His voice boomed across the docks, commanding respect from every man within earshot. But it wasn't the chieftain that made Astrid's breath catch. It was the small figure standing beside him. The child couldn't be more than 7 or 8 summers old, slight and pale with an otherworldly quality that set them apart from the robust Viking children playing nearby. Where others ran and shouted with boisterous energy, this child moved with careful deliberation, as if every step required thought. Their hair fell in straight dark waves, and those strange eyes, one blue as winter ice, one brown as rich earth, seemed to absorb everything around them with unsettling intensity. "Kyle, stay close," Eriksson's voice carried on the wind, gentler than Astrid had ever heard it. The chieftain placed a protective hand on the child's shoulder, and she noticed how Kyle seemed to shrink slightly from even that kind touch. Other children approached, drawn perhaps by curiosity about the chieftain's presence, but they stopped short when they saw Kyle. Whispers passed between them, and Astrid caught fragments carried by the breeze. Strange one, cursed eyes, not natural. The children backed away, leaving Kyle standing alone beside their father, isolated by invisible barriers that seemed as solid as stone walls. Astrid knew that isolation intimately. She'd felt it growing stronger with each passing season, with every pitying look when her belly remained flat, with every whispered conversation that stopped when she entered a room. But watching this child experience such rejection stirred something fierce in her chest, a protective instinct she'd never felt before. Kyle's mismatched eyes swept the harbour and suddenly locked onto hers. For a heartbeat, Astrid forgot to breathe. The child stared at her with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul, as if recognizing something she didn't even know existed within herself. Then Kyle did something unexpected. They smiled. It was a small, tentative expression, but it transformed their entire face, revealing a longing so profound it made Astrid's heart ache. Before she could respond, a rough hand grabbed her arm and spun her around. Bjorn, her husband's brother, glared down at her with undisguised contempt. "What are you doing here, barren woman?" His voice was low but venomous. "You have no place among decent folk anymore." "I'm not bothering anyone," Astrid replied, trying to pull free from his grip. You're just what? Spreading your curse to our children? Looking for another man to disappoint? Bjorn's fingers tightened painfully around her arm. My brother was wise to cast you out. Now stay where you belong, in the wilderness with the other useless creatures. The commotion drew attention from nearby workers. Some looked sympathetic but quickly turned away, unwilling to involve themselves. Others nodded approvingly at Bjorn's harsh words. Astrid felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar shame washing over her like a cold tide. But then she heard it. A small voice, clear and carrying despite its youth. Let her go. Everyone turned toward the sound. Kyle stood at the edge of the dock, having approached while Bjorn berated Astrid. The child's strange eyes fixed on him with unwavering determination. What did you say? Bjorn snarled, clearly affronted that a child would dare address him. I said let her go, Kyle repeated, louder this time. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Jarl Eriksson appeared behind his child, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. His gaze moved from Bjorn's grip on Astrid's arm to his child's defiant stance, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Release her, Bjorn, the chieftain commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of leadership. And explain why you're manhandling a woman on my docks. Bjorn immediately dropped Astrid's arm, his face flushing red as he struggled to find words that wouldn't sound petty before his leader. The harbour had fallen silent, all work stopped as everyone waited to see how this confrontation would unfold. The frost bit deeper each morning, and Astrid's small shelter offered little protection against winter's advancing grip. She had managed to weave pine boughs into crude walls, but the gaps still let in the wind that carved through the valley like invisible knives. Her hands, once soft from her status as Bjorn's wife, now bore the rough calluses of survival. 3 weeks had passed since her exile, and she had settled into a rhythm of desperate efficiency. Dawn brought the search for water, breaking ice on the stream with stones. Midday meant foraging for the last stubborn berries and roots before snow buried them entirely. Dusk was for reinforcing her shelter and tending the small fire that meant the difference between life and death. It was during one of these evening rituals that she heard the crying. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks, a howl caught in the rocks, perhaps the call of some distant beast. But as she stilled her movements and listened with the acute hearing that hunger had sharpened, she recognized something unmistakably human. A child's wail, thin and desperate, carried on the bitter air. Astrid's heart hammered as she grabbed a burning branch from her fire. The sound came from deeper in the forest, past the cluster of ancient oaks where she had never dared venture in the growing darkness. Every instinct screamed warnings: bandits, wild animals, spirits of the restless dead. Yet the crying continued, and something deeper than logic pulled her forward. Her makeshift torch cast dancing shadows between the trees as she picked her way through the undergrowth. The wailing grew stronger, punctuated now by exhausted hiccups that spoke of a child who had been crying for far too long. Astrid's pace quickened despite the treacherous terrain. She found him in a small clearing, huddled against the base of a massive pine. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 winters old, his clothes torn and soiled, dark hair matted with leaves and dirt. When her torchlight fell upon him, he looked up with eyes so pale they seemed almost silver in the flame's glow, eyes that held a strange depth for one so young. "Mama?" he whispered, voice cracked from crying. Astrid's throat tightened. She approached slowly, as she would a wounded animal, extending her free hand. "I'm not your mama, little one, but I'm here now. What's your name?" The child studied her with those unsettling eyes. "Eric," he said finally. "I'm lost. Where is your family, Eric? Your village?" He pointed vaguely toward the mountains, then seemed to deflate further into himself. "Mama said to run. Bad men came. She said run and don't look back." His lower lip trembled. "But I got lost, and it's so cold." Astrid's mind raced. Raiders, most likely, the kind that swept down from the northern wastes to pillage isolated settlements before winter trapped them in their own territories. This boy might be the sole survivor of his village, his family likely dead or taken as slaves. She crouched before him, noting the blue tinge to his lips, the way his small frame shook with cold and shock. Left alone, he would not survive another night. The practical part of her mind whispered harsh truths. She barely had enough resources to keep herself alive, and a child would drain what little she had managed to gather. But as Eric looked up at her with those strange, knowing eyes, something shifted in her chest. For months, she had been told she was worthless, broken, less than a woman because her womb bore no fruit. Yet here was a child who needed what she had always longed to give: protection, care, love. "Come with me," she said, extending both arms. "I have a fire and shelter. You'll be warm." Eric hesitated for only a moment before launching himself into her embrace. His small body was frighteningly cold, and she could feel his ribs through his torn clothes. As she lifted him, she noticed something odd, a pendant around his neck, partially hidden beneath his shirt. It was carved from what looked like whalebone, etched with runes she didn't recognize. The journey back to her shelter seemed longer with the child in her arms. Eric had stopped crying but remained eerily quiet, his head resting against her shoulder with a trust that made her chest ache. By the time she reached her humble dwelling, her arms burned with exhaustion, but she felt more purposeful than she had in years. Inside the relative warmth of her pine bough walls, she settled Eric near the fire and began the work of caring for him. She heated water to clean his wounds, wrapped him in her spare furs, and shared the last of her precious dried fish. As she worked, she found herself humming. Old lullabies her own mother had sung, melodies she had always imagined singing to children of her own blood. Perhaps the gods had sent her a different kind of gift. Perhaps her destiny lay not in bearing children, but in saving them. As Eric finally fell asleep against her shoulder, Astrid stared into the dancing flames and felt something she had thought lost forever: hope. The morning mist clung to the fjord like ghostly fingers as Astrid made her way down the treacherous path to the shoreline. Her leather satchel bounced against her hip, filled with the herbs and salves she'd gathered during her exile. 3 moons had passed since the casting-out ceremony, and though her heart still bore the scars of rejection, her hands had found new purpose in healing. The fishing boats were already returning from their dawn ventures, their hulls heavy with silver-scaled bounty. She recognized Bjorn's weathered face among the fishermen, his eyes quickly averting when they met hers. Once he had courted her favor with carved trinkets and promises of a shared hearth. Now he crossed himself against ill fortune whenever she passed. Astrid. The voice belonged to Helga, the blacksmith's wife, whose swollen belly proclaimed her 3rd pregnancy. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, and her usually rosy cheeks had taken on a sallow hue. "I need your help." The request came as a whisper, laden with shame and desperation. Women of the clan weren't supposed to seek aid from the banished, yet here stood Helga, one hand protectively cradling her unborn child. "The bleeding has returned," Helga continued, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Einar forbids me from seeing you, but the wise women offer only prayers to Frigg. I need something stronger." Astrid's fingers found the leather pouch containing dried nettle and shepherd's purse. During her wanderings in the wild forests beyond clan territory, she had encountered an ancient woman who dwelt in a hut adorned with hanging herbs. The crone had shared knowledge passed down through generations of healers, wisdom that transcended the boundaries of clan politics. "Meet me at the old fishing hut after the evening meal," Astrid said quietly. "Tell no one." As Helga hurried away, Astrid noticed a small figure watching from behind a stack of lobster traps. Raven, the chieftain's enigmatic child, stepped into view with the fluid grace of a shadow-given form. The boy, though some days Astrid wondered if that designation truly fit, wore dark woolen clothes that seemed to absorb the morning light. "You help her," Raven observed, tilting his head with that peculiar bird-like gesture that had earned him his name, "even though she fears you." "Fear and need often walk hand in hand," Astrid replied, studying the child's pale features. In the weeks since her exile, she had glimpsed Raven wandering the settlement's edges, always alone, always watching. What brings you to the docks so early?" Raven's dark eyes, startling in their intensity, fixed upon her face. "I dream of ships burning on black water. The dreams taste of iron and sorrow." He paused, fingers trailing along the rough wood of the pier. "You taste of green growing things and wolf song." The strange words sent a chill down Astrid's spine. She had heard whispers about the chieftain's child, rumors of prophetic visions and an otherworldly nature that made even the bravest warriors uncomfortable. Jarl Magnus kept Raven close but separate, protected yet isolated. "Dreams can be treacherous things," Astrid said carefully. "What do yours tell you about the burning ships?" "They come from the east, bearing men with crosses burned into their flesh. They will take children for their strange god." Raven's young voice carried an authority that seemed to echo from ancient places. "But there is hope in the wolf-song woman. Hope wrapped in healing hands." Before Astrid could respond, heavy footsteps announced the approach of Magnus's men. Orm the red-bearded emerged from between the storage huts, his hand resting on his sword hilt with casual menace. "Raven," Orm called sharply, "your father seeks you. Come away from the witch." Astrid bristled at the epithet, but held her tongue. Raven, however, fixed the warrior with a stare that seemed to pierce straight through to his marrow. "Tell my father I will return when the tide changes," the child said with quiet authority. "And Orm." The witch comment was unwise. The gods hear all words, especially those spoken in ignorance. The big man visibly paled, taking a step backward. Astrid watched in fascination as Raven's presence seemed to expand, filling the space around them with an almost palpable weight. For a heartbeat, she could have sworn she saw the flicker of raven wings in the child's shadow. Then the moment passed, and Raven was simply a small figure walking away along the pier, leaving behind only the echo of strange prophecies and the lingering scent of storm winds. Orm muttered a prayer under his breath before stalking away, but not before shooting Astrid a look that promised future trouble. She gathered her belongings and began the climb back to her cave dwelling, her mind churning with questions about prophetic children and burning ships. That evening, as she prepared the healing draught for Helga, Astrid found herself thinking less about her own exile and more about the destiny that seemed to be unfolding around her, like the threads of an intricate tapestry. The child's fever broke on the third day, but Astrid remained vigilant, monitoring each breath, each flutter of the small eyelids. She had moved them both to a sheltered alcove she'd discovered deeper in the cave system, a natural chamber where the stone walls seemed to hold warmth, and the sound of dripping water created a soothing rhythm. Magnus stirred as dawn light filtered through the cave entrance, his pale eyes focusing on her face with startling clarity. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his small hand reached out, fingers wrapping around her thumb with surprising strength. "Hungry," he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. Relief flooded through her as she reached for the remaining bread, softening it with water from her water skin. As he ate, she studied his features more carefully in the growing light. There was something familiar about the set of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. Something that nagged at the edges of her memory. "Magnus," she said gently, "can you tell me about your mother, your father?" The boy's chewing slowed. His eyes grew distant, as if looking into a place she couldn't see. Mama had yellow hair, like sunlight on water. His voice carried a wistfulness that made Astrid's chest tighten. "She sang to me when the dreams came." "What dreams?" Magnus set down the bread, his small face growing solemn. "The fire dreams. The ones with voices." He looked directly at her then, and Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. "Do you hear them too?" Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the cave entrance. Astrid's hand moved instinctively to her sax, but she recognized the purposeful stride. Eric emerged from the shadows, his expression grim. "We need to move," he said without preamble. "Bjorn sent scouts. They're half a day behind me, maybe less." Astrid gathered their meager possessions quickly, but Magnus had gone rigid beside her, his breathing shallow and rapid. "The angry man," he whispered, pressing himself against the cave wall. "He's coming." Eric's expression softened as he crouched down to the boy's level. "You're safe, little one. I won't let him hurt you." Something passed between them, a look of recognition that made Astrid's pulse quicken. She caught Eric's arm as he stood. "You know who he is." It wasn't a question, and Eric didn't treat it as one. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. "Magnus is Bjorn's son, his only heir." The words hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Bjorn has no—" She stopped, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. The thrall woman, the one who died last winter. Ingrid. Eric's voice was soft with old grief. "She was more than a thrall to some of us. Bjorn claimed the child when she died, but—" He glanced at Magnus, who was watching them with those two knowing eyes. "The boy has abilities. Bjorn fears what he doesn't understand." "What kind of abilities?" As if summoned by her question, Magnus spoke, his voice taking on an odd, distant quality. "The ravens told me you would come. The woman with the empty cradle would become the shield mother." His pale eyes fixed on Astrid. "They told me you would choose love over law." A chill ran down Astrid's spine. She had heard whispers of such gifts, children born with the sight, touched by the gods themselves. In some clans they were revered as oracles, in others they were feared as cursed. Eric was already moving toward the cave entrance. "We can discuss this on the road. If we're caught here, none of it will matter." Astrid lifted Magnus, surprised again by how light he felt in her arms. The boy settled against her shoulder with a trust that both humbled and terrified her. As they left the cave, she felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a cloak. The morning mist clung to the valleys below as they picked their way down treacherous paths. Eric led them away from the main routes, following deer tracks and forgotten shepherds' paths that wound through dense forest. Magnus dozed fitfully against Astrid's shoulder, occasionally murmuring words in his sleep that sounded like prophecy. "Where are we going?" she asked during a brief rest, watching Eric scan the horizon with practiced eyes. "North. There are allies there who will shelter us." He paused, his gaze finding hers. "But I need to know. Are you prepared for what this means? Taking Bjorn's son, his heir? There will be no going back." Astrid looked down at the sleeping child in her arms, at the small hand still curled around her finger. She thought of her empty house, her barren reputation, the life she'd been cast out from. Then she thought of Magnus's fever breaking under her care, of his trust, of the strange certainty that had settled in her bones. "I was never going back anyway," she said quietly. "Besides, I think this was always meant to be." The storm that had threatened for days finally broke over the settlement just as Astrid finished securing the last of the food stores. Rain lashed against the shutters with violent fury, and wind howled through every gap in the wooden walls. She had learned to read the signs, not just of weather, but of the restless energy that preceded Ragnar's darker moods. She found him in the great hall, staring into the fire with that hollow expression she'd come to recognize. The flames cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, making the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw appear to writhe like a serpent. He held a drinking horn loosely in one hand, but it remained untouched. "The boy asks for you," she said quietly, approaching with careful steps. Ragnar's jaw tightened. "Tell him I'm occupied. He's frightened by the thunder. A father's presence. I am not his father." The words came out sharp and final, like the crack of a whip. Astrid stopped walking, studying his rigid profile. In the weeks since she'd taken on caring for Eric, she'd watched this same scene play out countless times. The chieftain who could face down enemies without flinching seemed unable to look his own child in the eye for more than a few moments at a time. "Then what are you to him?" she asked. Ragnar's knuckles whitened around the horn. His burden, his curse. He finally lifted the horn to his lips, draining half its contents in one pull. "Just as he is mine." Thunder crashed overhead, and somewhere in the depths of the longhouse, Eric's frightened cry echoed through the corridors. Astrid felt something fierce and protective surge within her chest. not just for the boy, but for the broken man before her. "You're afraid of him," she said, the realization coming to her with startling clarity. Ragnar's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with dangerous intensity. "I fear nothing." "You fear what he represents, what he means." Astrid took another step closer, her voice steady despite the way his gaze could cut through stone. "You fear that loving him will destroy you both." For a moment, she thought he might strike her. His whole body coiled like a spring wound too tight, and she could see the war raging behind his eyes. Then, as another of Eric's cries pierced the air, something in him seemed to crumble. "You know nothing of what you speak," he said, but the fire had gone out of his voice, leaving only ash. "I know that boy needs you, and I think you need him just as much." Ragnar stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "His mother died, bringing him into this world. Everything I touch withers and dies, Astrid. Would you have me destroy the last piece of her that remains?" The raw pain in his voice made her heart clench. She understood now. The distance, the coldness, the way he watched Eric with such carefully guarded expressions. He wasn't protecting himself from the boy, he was protecting the boy from himself. "So instead you let him grow up believing his father doesn't want him? That he's unwanted and unloved?" She shook her head. "That's not protection, Ragnar. That's cowardice." The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Chieftains had killed men for less, and they both knew it. But Ragnar didn't reach for his sword. Instead, he sank back into his chair as if the weight of her words had physically struck him. "She made me promise," he whispered. "Sigrid. As she lay dying, she made me swear I would keep him safe. How can I do that when everything I am, everything I've done, marks him for the same fate?" Astrid moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability he so rarely allowed anyone to see. By being his father, by showing him how to be strong without being cruel, how to lead without becoming a tyrant, by letting him know he's loved. Another crack of thunder, followed immediately by Eric's voice calling for her. But this time, mixed with her name, she heard something else. A small, hopeful papa? Ragnar's face went white. The drinking horn slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor and spilling mead across the stones. "He's waiting," Astrid said softly. "They both are. Eric and that little boy inside you who remembers what it felt like to need a father's comfort during a storm." She turned and walked toward the corridor that led to Eric's chamber, her footsteps echoing in the vast hall. Behind her, she heard the creak of leather and wood as Ragnar shifted in his chair. She didn't look back, didn't push. Some journeys could only be taken by choice. Halfway down the corridor, she heard heavier footsteps following her. A small smile touched her lips as she reached Eric's door, Ragnar's presence a warm shadow at her back. Perhaps the greatest fathers, like mothers, weren't always born to their calling. Sometimes they simply had to choose to answer it. The storm that had raged for 3 days finally broke at dawn, leaving the world crystalline and still. Astrid stood at the cave mouth, watching steam rise from the warming rocks as Magnus stirred behind her. The child had grown stronger during their confinement, his fever breaking on the second night. But something had changed in him that went beyond mere physical healing. "The voices are quieter now," he whispered, joining her at the entrance. His small hand slipped into hers with a trust that still surprised her. "Good," she replied, though she wondered if that was entirely true. The strange dreams that had plagued her sleep suggested otherwise, visions of ships with black sails and warriors whose eyes held no humanity. "We should move today, find better shelter before the next storm comes." Magnus nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on something she couldn't see. "They're closer now, the ones who hunt me." A chill ran down Astrid's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How do you know?" "I can feel them, like thorns in my mind. They want what's inside me." His young voice carried a weight no child should bear. Astrid knelt beside him, studying his pale features. In the growing light she could see faint marks along his temples, thin silver lines that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. They hadn't been there before. "Magnus, what aren't you telling me about your father? about why Jarl Erik really sent you away." The boy's jaw tightened in a gesture startlingly reminiscent of his father. "He said I was cursed, that the gods had marked me for something terrible." He touched the silver lines unconsciously, but the old woman, the one who came from the eastern lands, she said I was blessed, that I could see the threads that bind the world together. "What threads?" "The ones that connect all living things. I can see them, touch them sometimes." His eyes met hers, ancient wisdom trapped in a child's face. "That's how I knew you would come. Your thread was already woven with mine." Astrid's breath caught. The dreams, the pull she'd felt toward this place, the certainty that had driven her through the wilderness, none of it had been chance. "Show me," she said quietly. Magnus hesitated, then reached out with one small finger to trace invisible patterns in the air. Where his finger passed, Astrid could swear she saw gossamer strands of light, delicate as spider silk, but somehow more real than the stone beneath her feet. "This is yours," he whispered, following a golden thread that seemed to emanate from her heart. "It's stronger than most, and this—" His finger traced another line, this one silver and pulsing. "This connects us." The implications hit her like a physical blow. The clan, they cast me out because they thought I was barren. But it wasn't about bearing children at all. "You were meant to find me." Magnus's voice held absolute certainty. "To protect me until I'm old enough to understand what I can do. And if the ones hunting you find us first." His expression darkened. "They'll try to use me to tear holes in the world, to let through things that should stay buried." He looked up at her with eyes far too old. "That's why my father had to send me away. The dreams were getting stronger, and I couldn't control what came through." Astrid felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a cloak. All her life, she'd been defined by what she couldn't do, couldn't bear children, couldn't be the wife her clan expected, couldn't find her place in their rigid structure. But perhaps that emptiness had been preparing her for this, to become something else entirely. "Then we run," she said simply. "As far and as fast as we need to." "Where?" "They can track me anywhere in Midgard." Astrid smiled grimly, remembering tales her grandmother had told of lands beyond the known world. "Not anywhere. There are places even the gods fear to tread. Islands where the old magic still holds sway, where the threads you speak of are too tangled for anyone to follow." Hope flickered in Magnus's eyes. "You know of such places?" "Stories, but stories are all we have right now." She gathered their meager supplies, mind already racing with plans. "My grandmother spoke of an island far to the west, where women who'd been cast out by their clans could find new purpose. They called it Raven's Rest. The ravens know the way to everywhere," Magnus said thoughtfully, "if we ask them properly." As if summoned by his words, a large raven landed at the cave entrance, its black eyes intelligent and knowing. It cawed once, then took flight toward the west. Astrid shouldered her pack and took Magnus's hand. "Then it seems we have our guide." They stepped out into the crystalline morning, leaving behind the life she'd known for the uncertain promise of whatever lay ahead. Behind them, far in the distance, something howled, a sound that spoke of hunger and ancient malice. But Astrid no longer felt the fear that had driven her from her clan. She had found her calling at last. The morning mist clung to the fjord like ghostly fingers as Astrid made her way down to the water's edge, Bjorn's small hand clasped firmly in hers. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival at Ericsson's hold, and while the settlement had begun to feel less foreign, she could not shake the weight of watching eyes that followed their every movement. "Why do the other children stare at me?" Bjorn asked, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the rocky shore. Astrid knelt beside him, studying his face in the pale dawn light. The boy's unusual features, the storm-grey eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, the silver-touched hair that caught moonlight even in shadow, marked him as different in ways that made the village folk whisper behind their hands. "People fear what they don't understand," she said carefully. "Your father was special. That gift lives in you too. Bjorn picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his palm. As his fingers traced its surface, tiny frost patterns spread across the rock like delicate spider webs. He didn't seem surprised by this magic, merely accepted it as naturally as breathing. "The old woman says I'm cursed," he murmured. Fire sparked in Astrid's chest. Sigrid, the settlement's eldest matron, had been spreading poison about the boy since their arrival. The crone claimed his presence would bring harsh winters and failed harvests, that his unnatural abilities marked him as touched by dark spirits. "Sigrid speaks from fear and ignorance," Astrid said firmly. "Your gifts are not a curse, Bjorn. They're part of who you are." Footsteps crunched on the pebbled beach behind them. Astrid turned to find Eriksson approaching, his weathered face grave in the morning light. The chieftain had been kind enough to offer them sanctuary, but she sensed his patience was not limitless. "The council meets today," he said without preamble. "There are concerns about the boy." Astrid rose slowly, positioning herself between Eriksson and Bjorn. "What kind of concerns?" 3 fishing boats returned empty yesterday. The nets came up full of ice instead of fish. His gaze flickered to the child. Old Gunnar swears he saw frost spreading across the water where the boy played 2 days past. "Coincidence," Astrid said, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Perhaps. But coincidence won't calm frightened people." Eriksson's tone was not unkind, but she heard the warning beneath his words. "Some are calling for solutions." Before Astrid could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the village. Shouts echoed across the water, urgent and filled with alarm. Eriksson cursed under his breath and strode toward the settlement, leaving Astrid and Bjorn to follow. They found a crowd gathered around the well at the village centre. Through the press of bodies, Astrid glimpsed what had caused the uproar. The water had frozen solid despite the mild autumn weather, and strange patterns swirled beneath the ice like captured lightning. "It's the boy!" Sigrid's voice cut through the murmur like a blade. "His presence poisons our very water." "The child must go," another voice added, "before winter comes early and we all starve." Astrid felt Bjorn's hand tighten in hers, his small body trembling. The crowd's mood was shifting, fear transforming into something uglier and more dangerous. She had seen this before, the way reasonable people could become a mob when terror took hold. "Enough!" Eriksson's command silenced the gathering. The chieftain studied the frozen well with calculating eyes before turning his attention to the crowd. "Fear makes fools of us all. This is a matter for the council, not the village square." But Astrid could read the signs in his weathered features. Political pressure was mounting, and even Eriksson's protection had limits. She thought of Magnus's words, spoken in those final moments before death claimed him, that his son would face trials that would test not just his power, but his very right to exist. As the crowd dispersed, muttering among themselves, Astrid noticed a figure watching from the shadows between 2 houses. Tall and lean with silver-streaked hair, the stranger studied Bjorn with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When their eyes met across the distance, the man smiled, a cold expression that promised nothing good. Then he melted back into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. "Who was that?" Bjorn whispered, and Astrid realized he'd seen the Watcher too. "I don't know," she admitted, but ice formed in her belly as she spoke the words. Something about the stranger felt familiar yet wrong, like a half-remembered nightmare taking shape in daylight. That evening, as she tucked Bjorn into his sleeping furs, the boy looked up at her with those 2 old eyes. "We'll have to leave soon, won't we?" Astrid smoothed his hair, her heart breaking at the resignation in his young voice. "Perhaps, but wherever we go, we face it together." Outside, winter winds howled despite the season, and somewhere in the darkness, she sensed patient eyes still watching. The morning mist clung to the fjord like ghostly fingers as Astrid watched Bjorn practice his swordwork in the clearing behind Einar's dwelling. 3 moons had passed since their arrival at the hidden settlement, and the boy had grown stronger. his movements more confident. Yet something troubled him today. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way he attacked the training post with unnecessary force. "Your stance is too wide," she called out, approaching with careful steps. "You'll lose your balance against a real opponent." Bjorn lowered his wooden sword, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "What does it matter? I'll never be a real warrior anyway." The bitterness in his voice caught her off guard. She'd grown accustomed to his quiet nature, his thoughtful questions about the plants they gathered and the remedies they prepared. This anger was new, sharp as a freshly honed blade. "Who told you such foolishness?" "The other boys." He kicked at a fallen log, his face flushed. "They say I'm weak, that I belong with the women grinding grain and mending nets. They say that's why my father sent me away." Astrid's heart clenched. She'd seen the way some of the settlement children looked at Bjorn, not with cruelty, but with the casual dismissal reserved for those who didn't fit their narrow understanding of strength. She knew that look well. "Your father sent you away to keep you safe," she said firmly. "There's a difference between weakness and wisdom." "Is there?" Bjorn's green eyes, so like Magnus's, blazed with frustration. "You were cast out too, for being barren, for failing at what women are supposed to do." The words hit like a physical blow, though she recognized her own bitter thoughts reflected in his young voice. How many times had she whispered similar accusations to herself during those first terrible days of exile? "Sit," she said, settling onto the moss-covered ground. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her. "Let me tell you about the winter I nearly died." She spoke of the blizzard that had caught her unprepared in the mountains, how she'd taken shelter in a cave with nothing but her cloak and a handful of dried meat. "I was so focused on proving I could survive alone that I'd ignored the warning signs. Pride nearly killed me, but you lived. Because I learned to listen, to the wind, to the animals, to my own body. Real strength isn't about forcing your will upon the world, Bjorn. It's about understanding your place in it and using that knowledge wisely." She watched him digest her words, his fingers absently plucking at the grass between them. In the distance, she could hear the settlement coming to life. Children's laughter, the rhythmic thunk of axes splitting wood, the low murmur of conversation. "Einar says I have the sight," Bjorn said suddenly, "that I can see things others cannot, but the boys mock me when I speak of the visions." Astrid's breath caught. She'd suspected something of the sort, had seen him stare into the fire with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. What kind of visions? Ships, many ships, with red sails and blood on the water. His voice dropped to a whisper. "They're coming for me, aren't they? My half-brothers?" The chill that ran down Astrid's spine had nothing to do with the morning air. She thought of Magnus's warnings, of the political machinations that had driven them to this remote haven. If Bjorn truly had the sight, if his visions were more than childish imagination. "Perhaps," she said carefully. "But knowledge of what's to come can be its own kind of weapon. The question is what we do with that knowledge." A new voice interrupted them. Wise words, though perhaps spoken too freely. They turned to see Einar approaching, his weathered face grave. Behind him walked a woman Astrid didn't recognize. Tall and lean, with iron-grey hair braided in complex patterns that spoke of high rank. "This is Helga Ravenspeaker," Einar said. "She's come from the eastern settlements with news." Helga's pale eyes fixed on Bjorn with unsettling intensity. "So this is Magnus's whelp. He has the look of his grandfather about him." "You knew my grandfather?" Bjorn asked, rising to his feet. "I knew many things, boy, including why certain parties would pay handsomely for your capture." Helga's gaze shifted to Astrid, "and why others would die to prevent it. The blood of kings runs in strange channels, and yours is stranger than most." Astrid felt the world shifting beneath her feet like sand in a tide. "What are you saying?" "That the boy's visions are not mere fancy, and that his enemies are closer than you think." Helga smiled, but there was no warmth in it. 3 days' sail to the south, Magnus's ships burn. His enemies move north, following whispers and bribes. They will be here within the week. The practiced calm Astrid had cultivated shattered. Everything she'd built, every moment of peace they'd found in this place, all of it balanced on a knife's edge. But as she looked at Bjorn's frightened face, she felt something else rising within her, a fierce, protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon all morning finally unleashed its fury as Astrid and Magnus reached the sacred grove. Ancient oaks creaked and swayed, their branches creating a canopy that offered little protection from the driving rain. Lightning illuminated the standing stones that marked this place as holy ground, older than memory, older than the gods themselves. Magnus pressed close to her side, his small hand gripping hers with surprising strength. Since their encounter with the hunters 3 days ago, he had barely spoken, but his eyes held a new awareness that made Astrid's heart ache. The child was changing, growing into something she didn't yet understand, and time was running short. "The stones remember," Magnus whispered, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "They remember when the first ships came." Astrid knelt beside him, studying his face in the flickering light. "What do you see, little one?" His eyes had taken on that distant quality she'd grown to recognize, as if he was looking through time itself. Fire on the water, a woman with silver hair crying for her lost children, his gaze focused on Astrid suddenly. She was like you, cast out, but she found them again. Before Astrid could respond, a figure emerged from behind the largest standing stone. Bjorn stepped into the grove, his cloak heavy with rain, his weathered face grim. Behind him came 2 more figures that made Astrid's blood run cold. Jarl Erik and her former husband Gunnar. "So the outcast returns to holy ground." Eric's voice carried easily despite the storm. "How fitting that we should end this where the gods can witness." Astrid stood slowly, positioning herself between Magnus and the 3 men. "I claim sanctuary by the old laws. This grove is neutral ground." Gunnar laughed bitterly. "Sanctuary? You forfeited any protection when you stole what belongs to the clan." His eyes fixed on Magnus with an intensity that made the child shrink against Astrid's leg. "The boy belongs with his people," Bjorn said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "I've seen what he can do, Astrid. The visions, the healing touch. Our clan needs him." "Needs him for what?" Astrid's voice rose above the wind. "To be your oracle, your weapon? He's a child, Bjorn. He deserves to choose his own path." Erik stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Children don't choose. They obey, as do barren women who overstep their place." The insult hung in the air like a blade, but Astrid felt no sting from it now. In the past months, she had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The woman who had once wept in shame at being cast out was gone, replaced by someone who would face down wolves and warriors alike for the child at her side. "I was never barren," she said quietly, her words cutting through the storm. "I was simply meant to mother in a different way." Lightning struck nearby, so close the thunder was instantaneous, and in that moment of blinding light, Magnus stepped forward. The child seemed to grow taller, his presence suddenly commanding despite his small frame. "The silver-haired woman didn't lose her children," he said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "She saved them. She led them across the ice when the fires came, and they lived because she chose love over duty." Erik's face darkened. "Enough of this mystical nonsense. Boy, come here. Your grandfather commands it." But Magnus didn't move. Instead, he looked up at Astrid with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "The dreams are clearer now. I see 3 paths. In one, I go with them and become their tool, and the clan dies when the great winter comes. In another, I run and hide, and the knowledge dies with me. But in the third—" He paused, rain streaming down his face like tears. "In the third, I choose my own family. I learn to use this gift not as a weapon, but as a bridge. And when the time comes, I help our people find their way to new lands, new hope." Gunnar spat in disgust. "Pretty words won't change what must be. Erik, take the boy. I'll deal with the woman." But as the three men moved forward, the storm seemed to intensify around Magnus. The wind howled through the grove with unnatural force, and the ancient stones began to resonate with a deep thrumming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Astrid felt power crackling in the air around them, wild and untamed. This wasn't the gentle healing magic she'd seen Magnus use before. This was something primal, connected to the very bones of the land. "Choose," Magnus said, his voice somehow audible despite the chaos around them. "The old ways that lead to ruin, or the new path that leads to survival. But know this, I am no longer the frightened child you once knew, and she is no longer the cast-out woman you scorned." The storm reached its crescendo, and in the heart of its fury, Astrid understood that everything they had endured had led to this moment of choice. The storm struck without warning, turning the fjord into a churning cauldron of black water and white foam. Astrid pressed herself against the cave wall, pulling young Einar closer as the wind howled like banshees across the narrow opening. The boy trembled against her side, not from cold, but from the fever that had gripped him for 3 days now. "Tell me again about the northern lights," Einar whispered, his voice barely audible above the tempest. Astrid smoothed his damp hair, feeling the heat radiating from his small body. They dance across the sky like ghostly warriors, painting the darkness with ribbons of green and gold. She kept her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. The fever wasn't breaking, and their meager supplies of healing herbs were nearly exhausted. Thunder crashed overhead, followed by the sharp crack of splitting wood. Through the cave mouth she glimpsed a ship's mast snapping like kindling against the rocky shoreline below. Her heart lurched as she recognized the dragon-carved prow. It was one of Gunnar's vessels, likely returning from a trading expedition. "Stay here," she commanded, tucking the furs tightly around Einar. "Don't move, no matter what you hear." The boy's fevered eyes widened. "Don't leave me more." The word still caught her off guard, that simple title he'd begun using weeks ago, Mother. She pressed a kiss to his burning forehead. "I'll be back before you can count to 100, I promise." Astrid plunged into the storm, the wind immediately trying to tear her from the narrow ledge. Rain lashed her face like icy needles as she half climbed, half fell down the treacherous path to the shore. The ship lay broken on the rocks, waves pounding its hull with merciless force. A cry pierced the storm, human, desperate. She spotted a figure clinging to a piece of debris in the churning surf, already weakened and losing his grip. Without hesitation, she waded into the frigid water, fighting the current that sought to drag her under. The man was one of Gunnar's warriors, someone who had watched in silence as she was cast out months ago. Now his eyes held only gratitude as she hauled him toward shore, both of them battered by waves that seemed determined to claim them. Others, he gasped as they collapsed on the rocky beach. 3 more in the water. Astrid's lungs burned, her limbs already numb from cold, but she turned back to the waves. The next hour passed in a blur of salt spray and desperate rescue attempts. She pulled 2 more men from the fjord's hungry grasp, though the third had already been claimed by the depths. As the storm finally began to subside, the survivors huddled around a fire she'd managed to kindle in a sheltered alcove. The men watched her with something approaching awe, this woman they'd once dismissed as cursed. "You saved us," said Bjorn, the warrior she'd rescued first. "Why?" The question hung in the salt-tinged air. These men served the chieftain who had exiled her, who had declared her worthless to the clan. She could have let the sea take them without consequence. "Because it was right," she said simply, wringing water from her sodden cloak. A new voice cut through the crackling of flames. Well spoken. Astrid spun to find Gunnar himself emerging from the shadows beyond the fire's reach, his face grave but unreadable. Her hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt, though she knew it would be useless against him. "I followed the coast when the storm hit," he explained, settling beside the fire with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command. "Saw the wreckage, saw what you did." The rescued warriors looked between their chieftain and the woman who had saved them, tension crackling like the flames. Gunnar studied Astrid for a long moment, and she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "The clan needs women like you," he said finally. "Women who choose courage over comfort, duty over safety." "The clan cast me out as barren and useless," Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. The clan was wrong. The admission cost him. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes. "I was wrong." Before she could respond, a weak cry echoed from above. Einar, calling for her through his fever. Gunnar's head snapped up, his warrior instincts detecting the sound even over the wind. "Who else is here?" he demanded. Astrid's mouth went dry. There was nowhere to run, no way to hide the truth any longer. "Your son." The words hit Gunnar like a physical blow. His face went white, then flushed with an emotion she couldn't name. Hope, fear, rage, all warring for dominance. "Impossible," he breathed. "Einar died with his mother." "No," Astrid said, rising to her feet with newfound resolve. "He lived. And he needs help." The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning stillness like thunder across calm waters. Astrid's hand instinctively moved to the iron blade at her hip as she counted the riders, 12 of them, bearing the raven banners of Jarl Magnus. Behind her, she could hear Sigrid gathering little Kyle closer, the child's mystical humming falling silent for the first time in days. "They've found us," Sigrid whispered, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. Astrid stepped forward, placing herself between the approaching riders and the small cave where they'd sheltered through the night. The lead rider raised his hand, bringing the war party to a halt just beyond the reach of her blade. She recognized him, Eric the Black-Handed, Magnus's most trusted warrior, and the man who had once offered for her hand before the truth of her barrenness became known. "Astrid Iron's daughter," Eric called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "You will return with us. The Jarl commands it." "I answer to no Jarl who would sacrifice children for his own gain," she replied, her voice steady despite the thunder of her heartbeat. "Turn back, Eric. This doesn't concern you." Eric dismounted, his weathered face showing something that might have been regret. "You know I cannot do that. The child belongs to the clan. The seer has spoken. His blood will determine our fate in the coming war." "His blood?" Astrid's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "The seer sees only what serves Magnus's hunger for power. That child is not a weapon to be wielded." From behind her came the soft sound of footsteps. Kyle emerged from the cave, his pale blue eyes fixed on the warriors with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably in their saddles. The runes carved into his small arms seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and when he spoke, his voice carried an otherworldly resonance. "The ravens gather, but the wolf remembers," the boy said, his gaze finding Eric's. "You served my father once with honor. Will you serve his memory now?" Eric's hand tightened on his sword hilt, but Astrid saw the uncertainty flickering across his features. The child's words had struck some hidden target, awakening old loyalties that Magnus's gold hadn't quite buried. "The boy speaks in riddles," one of the other warriors muttered. "Let's take them and be done with it." But Eric raised a warning hand. "Wait." He studied Kyle with new attention, and Astrid realized he was seeing something in the child's features that she had noticed but never fully understood. "Your eyes, they're the same color as Thorvald's," Kyle finished quietly. "The brother Magnus betrayed to claim his throne." The revelation hit the war party like a physical blow. Several warriors exchanged glances, and Astrid saw doubt creeping into their ranks like poison through clear water. The political implications were staggering. If Kyle truly was Thorvald's son, his claim to leadership would supersede Magnus's entirely. "Lies," Eric said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Thorvald died childless in the eastern raids." "Did he?" Sigrid stepped forward, her healer's robes rustling in the morning breeze. Or did Magnus ensure that truth was buried along with the man who spoke it? "I delivered this child myself, from a thrall woman Magnus kept hidden, a woman who bore the silver arm ring of the royal line." Astrid felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The mysterious circumstances of Kyle's birth, Magnus's desperate need to control the boy, the seer's cryptic prophecies, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. The chieftain hadn't been trying to harness some mystical power. He'd been trying to eliminate the last threat to his stolen throne. Even if this were true, Eric said slowly, the boy is still underage. Magnus remains. His words were cut short by the sound of horns echoing across the valley. 3 long blasts, repeated twice, the signal for enemy ships sighted. All eyes turned toward the distant fjord, where the morning mist was beginning to reveal the distinctive, dragon-headed prows of Danish longships. The invasion, one warrior breathed. It's begun. In the chaos of shouted orders and wheeling horses, Astrid made her choice. She grabbed Kyle's hand and whistled sharply, the signal she'd arranged with Bjorn, who had been watching from the ridgeline above. The old scout appeared as if from thin air, leading 2 horses down a hidden path. "Choose, Eric," Astrid called out, as she lifted Kyle onto the nearest mount. "Serve a usurper who would bleed children for power, or help us protect the true heir until he's old enough to claim what's rightfully his." Eric's weathered face was a battlefield of competing loyalties. Then Kyle spoke again, his young voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. "I don't ask for your swords," the boy said, "only for time to grow into the leader our people need. Will you give me that gift?" Eric's answer would determine everything that followed. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke as Astrid led Bjorn and the other children through the narrow mountain pass. Rain lashed against the rocky walls, turning the path treacherous with mud and loose stones. Behind them, the distant glow of burning settlements painted the sky an ominous orange. "Stay close," Astrid called over the howling wind, her hand firmly gripping Bjorn's as he stumbled beside her. The boy's face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes held a determination that reminded her so strongly of Eriksson it made her chest ache. They had been traveling for 3 days since fleeing the clan's winter settlement, barely staying ahead of Ragnar's forces. The usurper had moved faster than anyone anticipated, crushing the northern clans one by one in his quest to claim Bjorn and eliminate any threat to his rule. What Astrid hadn't expected was how many people would choose to follow her rather than submit to Ragnar's tyranny. "Astrid," called Torvin, the old warrior who had appointed himself her reluctant second-in-command. "The children can't go much further in this weather." She looked back at their ragged band, 23 people in total, including 8 children ranging in age from 5 to 15. They were farmers, craftsmen, and a handful of warriors who had lost everything when Ragnar's army swept through their lands. Not exactly the force of seasoned fighters she would have chosen, but they were hers now, and she would protect them with her life. "There," Bjorn said suddenly, pointing through the sheets of rain. "I can see it." Astrid squinted where he indicated and felt her heart lift. The cave entrance was barely visible through the storm, hidden behind a curtain of water cascading down the cliff face. It was exactly where the old seer, Magnus, had said it would be before she died defending the village. "Everyone, this way!" Astrid shouted, guiding the group toward the concealed opening. One by one they squeezed through the narrow gap behind the waterfall and into the blessed dryness beyond. The cave was larger than Astrid had dared hope, with passages leading deeper into the mountain. More importantly, there were signs of previous habitation. Fire-blackened stones arranged in a circle, old storage alcoves carved into the walls, and the faint smell of preserved food. "Start a fire," she instructed Torvin while gathering the children around her. "Small flames only. We don't want smoke giving away our position." As the adults began setting up their temporary shelter, Bjorn tugged on Astrid's sleeve. "She's here," he whispered, his young voice carrying an odd certainty. "Who's here?" Before he could answer, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows of the cave. Astrid's hand moved instinctively to her sword, then froze as recognition dawned. The woman was ancient, her back bent with age, but her eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to illuminate the darkness around her. "Helga," Astrid breathed. The legendary Volva, the seer priestess who had supposedly vanished into the mountains decades ago, was nothing more than bones and determination wrapped in wolf pelts, yet her presence filled the cave with an almost tangible power. "You're late," Helga said, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "I've been waiting 3 winters for you to arrive. You knew we were coming." The old woman's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Child, I've been watching the threads of fate weave themselves into this pattern since before you were born. The barren woman who would become mother to more than her own blood. The lost boy who carries the key to tomorrow, the choice that will determine whether our people survive the darkness ahead." Bjorn stepped forward, showing no fear of the fearsome woman. "You're the one who taught my father about the old ways, about the power that runs in our bloodline." Helga nodded, studying the boy with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. "Your father understood only half the truth. He thought the gift was his to wield, but it was never meant for him. It was meant for you and for those who would guide you to your destiny." "What gift?" Astrid asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "The ability to speak with the spirits of the land itself," Helga replied. "To call upon the old powers that existed long before men ever set foot on these shores. It's why Ragnar wants the boy so desperately, not just to eliminate a rival claim, but to steal a power that could make him unstoppable." Thunder crashed overhead, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of horns echoing through the mountains. Ragnar's search parties were getting closer. "Then we'd better make sure he never gets the chance," Astrid said firmly, pulling Bjorn closer to her side. The boy looked up at her with absolute trust, and she felt something settle into place inside her chest, not the desperate protectiveness of the past weeks, but something deeper and more certain. This was her purpose, not to bear children of her body, but to forge a family from choice and love and shared determination, and she would burn down the world before she let anyone take that from her. The sacred grove felt different as Astrid approached with Magnus at her side, the ancient oaks seeming to lean inward as if listening to secrets carried on the wind. 3 days had passed since the ritual that revealed Magnus's true nature, and the boy walked with a newfound confidence that both thrilled and terrified her. His golden hair caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, and she could see the subtle changes in his bearing, the way he held his shoulders straighter, how his eyes seemed to perceive things beyond the physical world. "The trees are restless," Magnus murmured, his small hand finding hers. "They know what's coming." Astrid squeezed his fingers gently. Since awakening his seer's gift, Magnus had spoken increasingly of things only he could perceive. The weight of guiding him through this transformation pressed heavily on her shoulders, especially knowing that Eric remained skeptical of the boy's visions. They reached the circle where Solveig waited, her weathered face grave as she tended a small fire. The wise woman looked up as they approached, and Astrid saw something troubling in her ancient eyes. "You've seen something," Astrid said, settling Magnus on a moss-covered stone. Solveig nodded slowly. "The bones sang to me in the night. Ships approach from the southern waters, not traders but raiders. They come seeking the child." Ice formed in Astrid's veins. How could they know? Word travels in strange ways when magic is involved. There are those who would use a young seer for their own purposes, twist his gift into a weapon. Solveig's gnarled hands stilled over the flames. "But that is not the greatest threat we face." Magnus straightened on his stone perch, his blue eyes suddenly distant. "The woman with the silver hair. She's with them." Both women turned to him sharply. Astrid knelt before the boy, gripping his shoulders. "What woman, little one?" "She wears blue like the deep sea, and her hair shines like moonlight on water. She says she's my grandmother, but her smile is cold like winter ice." Magnus shivered despite the warm air. "She wants to take me away from you." Astrid's blood turned to ice water. She had heard whispers of such a woman, Sigrid the Ruthless, whose own clan had been destroyed by her ambition and hunger for power. If Magnus was indeed descended from that bloodline, it explained much about his abilities and the dangerous attention they had drawn. "When do they arrive?" Astrid asked Solvig, though part of her already knew the answer from the urgency thrumming through her bones. Before the moon reaches its peak tonight. The wise woman scattered herbs into the flames, sending up aromatic smoke. Eric knows. He's already preparing the clan's defenses. Astrid felt the familiar pull of two loyalties, a duty to the clan that had finally accepted her, and her fierce protection of the child who had become her world. There must be another way. We could take Magnus and flee. No. The boy's voice carried an authority that startled them both. Running won't solve anything. The silver-haired woman will keep hunting, and other clans will suffer. I've seen it. Magnus, you're just a child. I'm the child of prophecy, he said simply, without arrogance, merely stating fact. And you're the mother who was chosen for me. Together we're stronger than we are apart. Solveig studied them both with calculating eyes. The boy speaks wisdom beyond his years, but there is a way to tip the scales in our favor. Astrid, your own gifts have been growing stronger since you bonded with the child. It's time to stop hiding from what you've become. I don't understand. The old woman smiled, and for the first time in days, it held warmth. You were cast out for being barren, but that emptiness made space for something greater. You've become a vessel for protective magic, a shield mother. When you fight to defend Magnus, you'll find strength you never knew you possessed. As if to prove her words, Astrid felt a warmth spreading through her chest, different from anything she'd experienced. It felt like sunlight and steel, fierce love transformed into tangible power. The raiders will expect to face warriors with sword and axe, Solveig continued. They won't anticipate magic turned to defense rather than conquest. Magnus slipped down from his stone and wrapped his arms around Astrid's waist. I'm not afraid, he whispered against her leather tunic, not with you protecting me. The trust in his voice nearly broke her heart. This boy who could see futures and speak with spirits, who carried the weight of prophecy on his small shoulders, still looked to her for safety. The barren woman who had been deemed worthless by her birth clan had become the most important person in a seer child's world. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Astrid held Magnus close and felt the protective magic singing in her veins. Whatever came with the darkness, they would face it together, mother and child, bound not by blood but by something far stronger. The storm that had raged for 3 days finally broke as dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Astrid stood at the bow of the longship, her weathered hands gripping the carved dragon's head as they approached the familiar coastline of her homeland. Beside her, Ada clutched the small wooden wolf that had become her constant companion during their journey, a gift from Bjorn before they'd departed the settlement where she'd found her true purpose. The child had grown so much in the months since Astrid first discovered her, hidden away in Jarl Magnus's household, no longer the frightened, silent waif who spoke only in whispers. Era now stood tall despite her small stature, her silver eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. The gift that had made her an outcast, the ability to see glimpses of what was to come, had flourished under Astrid's patient guidance. The harbour looks different, Era observed, her voice carrying the musical lilt that had developed as her confidence grew, smaller somehow. Astrid nodded, understanding exactly what the child meant. When you'd seen the vast world beyond your birthplace, when you'd discovered that your worth wasn't measured by the narrow expectations of one clan, everything familiar seemed diminished. Places change when we do, little raven, or perhaps we simply see them more clearly. The crew moved with practiced efficiency around them, preparing for landfall. These weren't the warriors who had once called Astrid barren and worthless. These were the men and women she'd fought alongside in the eastern settlements, who'd seen her stand against raiders twice her size, who'd watched her heal the sick and guide the lost. They looked at her with respect earned through deed, not granted by birth. Thorvald approached from the stern, his scarred face bearing an expression of concern. The watchtowers show no signal flags. That's unusual for midday. Astrid felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. She glanced at Era, whose small hand had moved instinctively to cover her eyes, a gesture that had become as recognizable as storm clouds on the horizon. When the child's visions came, they were rarely pleasant. "What do you see, little one?" Astrid asked gently, kneeling beside Era as the ship's crew continued their work around them. "Smoke," Era whispered, her voice distant, "but not from cooking fires. And Uncle Magnus, he's—" She shuddered, her small frame trembling as the vision took hold. "He's afraid. I've never seen him afraid before." Astrid's jaw tightened. Jarl Magnus had been the one to cast her out when her womb proved empty after 3 winters of marriage to his son. He'd called her cursed, worthless, a drain on the clan's resources. But he was also Era's blood, the uncle who'd kept the child alive even if he'd hidden her away like a shameful secret. Whatever was happening in their homeland, if it had Magnus frightened, the danger was real. As they drew closer to shore, the acrid smell of burning thatch reached them on the wind. Astrid's worst fears were confirmed when they rounded the final headland and saw the settlement spread before them. Half the longhouses showed signs of recent attack, roofs collapsed, walls blackened, fishing boats reduced to charred ribs along the beach. "Slavers," Thorvald growled, spitting into the sea. "The marks are unmistakable." But Astrid was already moving, her hand checking the sacks at her belt and the larger blade across her back. "Take us to the eastern beach," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned to wield. "We go in quietly. Thorvald, choose 4 of your best. Silent approach. Gather information first." "And the child?" one of the crew asked, gesturing toward Era. Astrid looked down at the girl who'd become more precious to her than her own life. In Era's silver eyes, she saw not the helpless waif who needed protection, but the young woman she was becoming, one whose gifts might be the key to saving what remained of their people. "She comes with us," Astrid decided. "Her sight may be the only advantage we have." As they prepared to disembark, Era tugged at Astrid's sleeve. The vision showed something else. She said quietly, "You, standing before the great hall. But you weren't the same woman who left. You were more. Like a queen, but not a queen. Something else." Astrid smiled, surprising herself with how calm she felt despite the chaos awaiting them on shore. "I know exactly what that something else is, little raven. I'm a mother, and mothers will move mountains to protect their children." The longship's keel scraped against sand and stone, and Astrid stepped onto the beach of her homeland for the first time in over a year. She was no longer the barren woman who'd been cast out in shame. She was Astrid the far-travelled, Astrid the battle-wise, Astrid the mother of the lost. And she had come home to claim what was rightfully hers. The sacred grove trembled with ancient power as Astrid held the rune-carved stone above her head. The air itself seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, and she could feel the eyes of 100 ancestors watching from the shadows between the ancient oaks. Beside her, young Bjorn stood with his small hand pressed against the largest tree's bark, his eyes rolled back white as visions flowed through him. "The darkness comes from within," he whispered, his child's voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Brother against brother, blood spilling sacred ground. Only the chosen mother can heal what was broken before birth." Astrid's breath caught as understanding flooded through her. The clan's recent troubles, the failed harvests, the mysterious sickness that had claimed 3 warriors, it all traced back to Jarl Eric's bitter rivalry with his younger brother Gunnar, who had been exiled 5 winters past. But Gunnar had not gone quietly into the wilderness. He had made pacts with dark spirits, twisted his heart toward revenge, and now his corruption was poisoning the very land that had cast him out. "The ritual," Astrid breathed, remembering the ancient words her grandmother had whispered before her death. "The binding of blood and earth." Lightning split the darkening sky, though no storm clouds gathered overhead. The wrongness in the air was growing stronger, pressing against the protective barriers of the sacred grove like wolves circling a dying fire. Astrid could hear them now, War horns echoing from the fjord below, the clash of steel on steel, screams carried on the wind. Gunnar had returned. Bjorn's small hand found hers, his touch burning with fevered heat. "Mother who was chosen," he said, using the title the spirits had given her in dreams, "you must decide. Save the clan that cast you out, or let the old ways burn and be forgotten." For a heartbeat, Astrid hesitated. The memory of her exile still cut deep, the shame, the loneliness, the nights she had wept into her empty arms and cursed the gods for making her barren. It would be so easy to walk away, to take Bjorn and disappear into the vast wilderness where they could live free from the cruelty of those who had judged her worthless. But then she thought of Helga, who had secretly brought her food during the hardest months, of young Thorvald, barely 15, who would die in battle before he ever knew love, of the children who played in the village square, innocent of their elders' failures. "They will know," she said quietly, pressing the runestone to her heart, "that a mother's love extends beyond blood." The ritual required 3 elements: the willing sacrifice of the pure-hearted, the blood of the true heir, and the blessing of the earth spirits. Astrid understood now why the Norns had guided her steps to this moment. She was the sacrifice, not her life, but her bitterness, her desire for revenge, her claim to the safety of exile. Bjorn was the heir, not to his father's throne, but to the older, deeper magic that flowed through the land itself. As for the earth spirits, they had been waiting in this grove since before the first longship touched these shores. Astrid knelt and pressed her palms to the mossy earth, feeling the ancient heartbeat that pulsed beneath all things. "Hear me, mothers of the deep places," she called in the old tongue. "I offer myself as vessel and guardian. Let the poison be drawn out through me. Let the broken bonds be healed by willing hands." The ground beneath her palms grew warm, then hot. Power rushed up through her arms like liquid fire, and she gasped as visions flooded her mind. The first settlers who had honored the land spirits, the gradual forgetting of the old ways, the growing arrogance that had allowed corruption to take root. She saw Gunnar as he truly was now, a hollow shell filled with malice, no longer truly human but something darker that wore his face. Bjorn placed his small hands over hers, adding his strength to hers. The boy's untrained power was wild and fierce, but Astrid's hard-won wisdom shaped it, directed it, channeled it into the ritual that would either save them all or destroy her utterly. Light blazed up from the grove, visible for miles across the darkening landscape. Below at the settlement, warriors paused in mid-strike as they felt the earth itself awakening beneath their feet. The corruption that had been slowly poisoning the land for 5 long years began to burn away like morning mist before the sun. And in the sacred grove, a barren woman who had found her true calling poured her love into the soil and prepared to face whatever darkness emerged from the flames. The final battle was about to begin, and this time a mother's heart would be the weapon that decided the fate of them all. The dawn light filtered through the smoke hole above, casting long shadows across the great hall where the clan had gathered. Astrid stood before them all, no longer the outcast who had fled in shame, but a woman transformed by purpose and pain into something fiercer than any Shieldmaiden. In her arms, young Bjorn pressed close against her shoulder, his small fingers clutching the amber pendant she now wore, the same stone that had once marked her as Barren, now transformed into a symbol of the unconventional family she had chosen to protect. Jarl Erik rose from his carved seat, his weathered face bearing the weight of decisions that had led them all to this moment. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the central fire and the distant cry of gulls over the fjord. "You have returned to us with more than we lost," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "The boy lives, and with him, the knowledge that will see our people through the coming winter." Astrid felt the collective gaze of her former clan members, some curious, others wary, but none showing the contempt that had driven her away. The woman who had once wept at their scorn now met their eyes without flinching. She had walked through fire and ice, faced down wolves both animal and human, and learned that motherhood was not about the blood that flowed through veins, but the love that flowed between hearts. "The old ways served us well," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "But they are not the only ways. Bjorn carries within him the wisdom of the seer folk, knowledge of the herbs and healing arts that could save us when swords cannot. What the clan called cursed, I have found to be blessed." Thora stepped forward from the crowd, her own child balanced on her hip. Once she had been among those who whispered about Astrid's empty womb. Now her face bore a different expression, one of understanding hard-won through her own trials of motherhood. "We have been fools," Thora said simply. "We measured worth by what grows in the belly, when we should have looked at what grows in the heart." Old Gunnar, his braided beard white as winter frost, tapped his staff against the stone floor. The sound echoed like a judgment, and Astrid tensed, remembering his harsh words from before. But when he spoke, his voice held unexpected warmth. "The gods work in ways that confound us mortals," he said. "Perhaps they took from you the ability to bear children because they meant for you to mother us all." Bjorn lifted his head from Astrid's shoulder, no longer the terrified child she had found cowering in the ruins of his village. The journey had changed him too, awakening something ancient in his blood that connected him to the old magics. When he spoke, his young voice carried an authority that made even the warriors lean forward to listen. "The Raven Mother saved me," he said, using the name he had given Astrid during their darkest hour, when she had fought like Odin's own messenger to protect him. "She taught me that strength isn't only in the arm that swings the sword, but in the hand that tends the wound after." Eric nodded slowly, and Astrid saw in his eyes the grief he had carried for sending away the woman who might have saved his own son, had she been there with her newfound knowledge of healing. Some mistakes could be forgiven, but never forgotten. "Then let it be known," the Jarl declared, "that Astrid Eriksdottir is restored to her place among us, not as she was, but as who she has become. Let the skalds sing of the mother by choice, who proved that the strongest bonds are forged not by blood alone, but by will and love and sacrifice." The hall erupted in voices, some cheering, others murmuring approval, a few still uncertain but willing to trust their Jarl's wisdom. Astrid felt tears threatening, but these were not the bitter drops of her exile. These were the sweet salt of homecoming. As the crowd began to disperse, Eric approached her privately, his expression grave but not unkind. "The boy will need training in his gifts," he said quietly, "and we will need someone to guide him who understands both the old ways and the new paths you've discovered." "He will have it," Astrid promised. "We are bound now, he and I, by something stronger than the ties that break." That evening, as the sun set fire to the fjord and painted the mountains gold, Astrid sat by the water's edge, with Bjorn beside her. They watched the waves roll endlessly toward shore, each one different, each one part of the same eternal sea. "Are we home now, Raven Mother?" Bjorn asked. Astrid pulled him closer, feeling the truth settle in her bones like warmth after long cold. "Yes, little one, we are home."